Hello, Deirdre.
Hello, Olive.
Lovely to see you with us once again. To everybody else, I would take great pleasure introducing Dr. Deirdre Serjeantson from Sydney Sussex College in Cambridge at Cambridge University, where you lecture in English now these days. Right. Deirdre is a long-time Dunnett reader, a Lymond fan, and has spoken to some of you before at Oxford Days, and her husband Richard very kindly presented a paper at one of our AGMs a few years ago. So it's really great and a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Deirdre Serjeantson, who will be talking on Lymond amongst the Roisterers. Over to you, Deirdre.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Look, before I start, I'm just going to share my screen experimentally to make sure you can see the pictures I'm going to show you, and you can tell me if that looks okay, and then I can get started. So here comes my screen, and if I click,
I ask that people go on mute. We're getting traffic noise in the background.
Okay. Okay, could I get a thumbs up from someone to say you can see Lymond among the Roisterers? Brilliant. Okay,
that's good. Yeah.
And is a little bit of me still visible on your screen when I share? Can you see me in a corner?
Right.
Okay, in that case, I won't worry about it, and I'll get started. This slide isn't really interesting enough just to be accompanied by voiceover for 5 minutes, so I just thought I'd check. Okay, well, look, thank you very much for having me back. There is a generally accepted rule in the world of undergraduate lecturing that you don't make your audience listen to very long passages of quotation. But I've decided this is the Dorothy Dunnett Society, and you have been training your concentration spans in a hard school of reading for years now. So here goes. I'm going to give you something long. This is a section from the second edition of John Fox's Acts and Monuments, which you might know better as the Book of Martyrs. And in fact, here's a picture of the cover and a close-up of a detail that we'll be talking about in a second. This is the great account of the emergence of Protestantism from the early church onwards, and it was a bestseller in the 16th century. The second edition was printed in 1570, and it added some up-to-date stories to the tales of woe, which had already featured in the printing of 1563. And here is Fox talking about the suffering of the early Protestants in France only a few years previously in 1557. So here we go. September the 4th, a company of the faithful, to the number of 300 or 400, were together convented in Paris, in a certain house, having before it the College of Plessis in the street of St. James, and behind it the College of Sorbonne, who there assembled in the beginning of the night to the intent to communicate together the Lord's Supper, but incontinent, by which he means immediately, but incontinent that was discovered by certain priests of Plessis, who gathered together such as were of their faction, came to beset the house, and made an outcry that the watch might come and take them, so that in short time almost all the city of Paris was up in armour, thinking some conspiracy to have been in the city. Who then, following the noise and perceiving that they were Lutherans, a great part of them were in extreme rage, furiously seeking to have their blood, and therefore stopped the streets and lanes with carts, and made fires to see that none of the Protestants should escape. The faithful, albeit God had given them leisure to finish their administration and prayers with such quietness as they never had better, seeing the suddenness of the thing, were stricken in great fear, who then, being exhorted by the governors of the congregation, fell to prayer. That done, through the counsel of some which knew the cowardly hearts of the multitude, this order was taken, that the men which had weapons should adventure through the press. Only the women and children remained in the house, and a few men with them, which were less bold than the other, to the number of 6 or 7 score. Where appeared the admirable power of God in them that went out with weapons, which notwithstanding that the lanes and passages were stopped, and the fires made, did all escape, save only one, who was beaten down with stones, and so destroyed. Certain that remained in the house with the women afterwards leapt into gardens, where they stayed till the magistrates came. The women, which were all gentlewomen, or of great wealth, only 6 or 8 excepted, seeing no other hope, and perceiving the fury of the people, went up to the windows, crying mercy, and showing their innocent intent, required justice ordinary, and they asked for a police, essentially, that they didn't have police at the time. Thus, as they were enclosed about 6 or 7 hours, at last came Martin, the king's attorney, with force of commissary and sergeants, who with much ado, appeasing the outrage of the people, entered into the house, where he viewed the women and children, and the other furniture there being prepared for that congregation, perceived testimony sufficient of their innocency, in so much that in considering thereof, for pity of heart, his eyes could not refrain from tears. Notwithstanding, proceeding in his office, he had them all to prison within the little castle. I omitted here the furious usage of the people by the way, how despitefully they plucked and hailed the women, tear their garments, thrust off their hoods from their heads, and disfigured their faces with dirt and dust. Now, I'm going to stop here, but the account goes on for pages. There's more about how unpleasant the prison, the Châtelet, was, and about the trials that followed of 3 members of the congregation who were put to death for their part in the proceedings. There's a great deal that is interesting in Fox's account, even in this short section. One is that the apprehension of a few hundred people at an illicit church service and a street brawl which saw 1 person killed should have been important enough to be reported abroad. Brawls and executions were commonplace at this time. However, this meeting in a private house in Paris was an event which attracted international attention, and which continues to attract international attention, which you can't say for very much of what goes on in the Book of Martyrs otherwise. Now, a political historian would say that it's important. And we know this because it took only a few weeks for ambassadors from the Protestant strongholds of Switzerland and Germany to arrive with letters from the grand old men of Protestantism, Calvin and Bullinger, pleading for the prisoners. John Knox, that Scottish firebrand and former galley slave, sent news of it back to Scotland. And this all mattered, this international fuss mattered, because with France at war with the Habsburgs on one front, and with an English force trying to retake Calais on the other front, France could not afford to alienate anyone else. And in particular, they had a treaty with Switzerland, and they were trying to levy 8,000 men from the Swiss cantons to help with the wars. Now, a social historian might be interested in Fox's very undemocratic account of the aristocratic nature of these Lutherans in this particular meeting, given that Protestantism was supposed to be the religion of the ploughboy and the woman at her spinning wheel and the tradesman. But what we see here is not actually snobbishness. It's Fox's hope that the presence of members of the nobility at the service might influence the course of the Reformation in France, and would continue to do so as his book comes out in 1570. A woman's historian would consider the treatment meted out to the female members of the congregation. If you look at the picture, I selected a little bit from the bottom corner of the frontispiece, where you can see what the meeting must have looked like. Somebody's preaching and everyone's sitting around very close with their Bibles open on their knees, and they're listening to the sermon. And you'll see that all of the women have their hair tied up neatly under their hats or their caps. The crowd tears off the caps or hoods of the women as they leave the meeting house. And that might seem inconsequential, but in fact, respectable married women always pinned up and covered their hair in public. Flowing locks were the sign of a prostitute. So the crowd outside was intent on disgracing these aristocratic court ladies in a very specific way. A rumor circulated afterwards that the meeting had in fact been an orgy. And that could well have been prompted by the sight of all of these bare-headed women in the street that night. But we are a different sort of historian. And for all of us, I suspect, the most interesting aspect of Fox's account is what or who he leaves out. Because you will have recognized that what Fox calls the Street of St. James is in fact the Rue de Saint-Jacques. And the unnamed house is the Hôtel Bétourné. and that among the terrified women waiting inside to be torn apart by the rioters, or maybe to be sent, as one of their number was, to be grateful for the mercy of being strangled rather than burned to death as a heretic, was the Maréchal de Saint-André, somebody we all know quite well. And you will know that the person who breaks up the street fight and extricates the Maréchal from her misfortunes is Lymond. You might not be surprised that he isn't mentioned by name in Fox's account, because of course he doesn't appear at this fateful event in his own person as Comte de Sévigné and King's Captain General. As he says himself, this is not an army affair. He cannot be seen to intervene in what is the city's business. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't have strategic and perhaps personal reasons for wanting to see the episode end as peacefully as possible. If nothing else, he really wants those Swiss soldiers to be sent, and he doesn't want that to blow up. So he borrows the robes of the king's brother, the very powerful Cardinal of Lorraine, and he heads off with Gerrit and Archie and Catherine d'Albon to save the day. But Fox doesn't say either that it is the cardinal who arrived with his men, who suppressed the violence in the Rue de Saint-Jacques, and who ordered that those members of the congregation still on the premises should be marched safely and in good order to the Petit Châtelet, which was the seat of civil authority and the prison in Paris. And here it is, a little bit later on. Fox identifies quite another authority. He says it was Martin, the king's attorney, who arrives at the troop of sergeants and who weeps in a faintly unlikely way over the virtue of the persecuted Lutherans. And now Martin is Jean Martin, who since 1546 had held the position of procurer of the king's procurer at the Châtelet, which is to say he was something like a public prosecutor, as we'd understand it now. He was in charge of keeping the peace. I have to say, this image of the Châtelet, which seems to be a place where people are meeting to beat each other up, doesn't speak very well of him, but this is in 1650, so well after Jean Martin's time, so we can't blame him for that. In Checkmate, Martin is arriving with his small force just as Lymond is leaving the scene, and we never actually meet him. And certainly the prisoners are already on their way, so he cannot be the one who stops the fight and disposes of the congregation. It's interesting that Fox gets it wrong, because there were hundreds of witnesses to the event, including those women who had been attending the church service and whose testimony Fox would have collected afterwards for his book. He was very keen on collecting eyewitness accounts and proud of getting things right. Now, the cardinal was a recognizable and memorable figure. So why does he disappear from the record here? Well, so I went and checked the other accounts of the evening, of which there are many. And I found that while most of the details remain remarkably constant, the fact, for instance, that there was time to finish the service, the suspicion that it was the authorities across the road at the Collège du Plessis who had reported them, the appearance of the women at the windows asking for mercy. The only detail which varies is that of the identity of the man who intervenes to save the congregation, so that they are taken prisoner rather than murdered on the spot by an angry mob. Claude Hatton, a Catholic priest who is associated with the court, says that it wasn't Jean Martin. He says it was the prévôt de l'hôtel, that is to say the provost or the head of the king's household. The king's household was responsible for provisions and making sure the household was running well. He seems like a rather unlikely choice in the event. So I think Hatton might have been thinking of some other of the provosts of Paris, of whom there was a confusing multiplicity. If you check Checkmate, you'll see that earlier in the day, Lymond had dined with the head of them all, the prévôt de Paris himself, the one who was in charge of everything, and he had left the meal early because of the word of disquiet in the university quarter. And of course, this is in the university quarter, and this is what he was going to sort out. And that evening, before Catherine d'Albon had come to seek his help, Archie had come to Lymond and had reported the threat of violence was growing. And Lymond had sent notes to the prévôt des marchands, the provost of merchants, who was something like a lord mayor. and also the Prévôt Général de la Connétable, who was the head of the police force, essentially, a very unofficial and ad hoc one. And he controlled the 500 or so armed men who kept the peace in Paris. Some accounts are so bewildered by this choice of provosts that they just mention a nameless magistrate. In the letter of John Knox, he takes a different tack, not a man given to understatement. He says that the captain who intervenes is the devil. It's just possible that Knox was thinking of the red robes of the cardinal, and that in the fevered Protestant polemic of the period, cardinals and devils were pretty much interchangeable. So that might be a hint to us. That might be as close as we can get to what we happen to know actually happened. My reading of the evidence is that the cardinal is left out because all of our historians have an agenda, which he does not fit. For Claude Hatton, a client of the de Guises, and of course the cardinal was a de Guise, it was just possible that he knew that it had not really been the cardinal that night, and that the cardinal was furious at the impersonation. In any case, he would have known that the Catholic faction would not necessarily wish to be represented as protectors of an assembly of heretics. There were also complicated court politics about the nobles who allied themselves with the Protestants, and these were the de Guise's enemies. He would not want to be seen as their savior. For the Protestant chroniclers, the situation was different. For them, the Cardinal of Lorraine was their sworn enemy, was the devil, and they would not have wanted to show him in a favorable light as the defender of the innocent and the oppressed. Indeed, in most Protestant accounts, the cardinal enters the story the next day as the originator of the orgy story. He apparently inspected the premises and found 8 large beds marked with what the accounts call the signs of lascivious conduct. And this was a very dangerous rumor in the context because it made the king inclined to be much harder on the prisoners who were about to come to trial. Knox calls him the cardinal whose hypocrisy is not able to cover his own filthiness, which is not, at least in a polemic, a role compatible with that of savior of women and small children. It's easy to see how a state official of no very great standing, like Jean Martin, someone who was very difficult to dig out of the records of state, could have been an easier person to credit with compassion and human tears. No one, of course, among the small circle who really had been there and who knew what had happened was about to name Lymond. So this is my long preamble to what I want to think about today, which is this motif of great feats of courage and ingenuity slipping through the gaps of history is one which recurs across the Lymond Chronicles. We see an echo of the theme a little later in the same evening, when Lymond leads his small company to find sanctuary in the porter's lodge of his old college, the College de Sainte-Barbe, and I have a map of that here for you. The black arrow in the center of the page identifies the Hôtel Bétourné, and top right, you can see another arrow pointing to the college. They didn't have to get very far to seek shelter, but the streets were pretty hectic and fraught that night. Lymond has not been forgotten in the porter's lodge of Sainte-Barbe, and the porter takes him in. And it shortly transpires that there is, in fact, a lively oral tradition about his student adventures. When the porter's son escorts the group to the river crossing, he quizzes Lymond about the stories he has heard. Is it true what he did to the professor's boots? Did he really set Orontius Phineas, that is the mathematician and map maker who must have taught maths at the college for a while, a theorem in which the letters spelt out something obscene? He doesn't get as far as saying what happened with the ladies of the Rue Glatinier, but I suppose nobody will be surprised to learn that this was one of the few streets in Paris which was licensed for prostitution. We also know from earlier in the escape that Lymond has spent time in the past climbing the high walls around his college, and presumably not just for the excellent exercise which climbing walls can afford. But we are to hear no more about any of these events. There's a hint, a note that there was an exploit there in the past, and then they're gone. Now, they are, of course, all very minor escapades compared with the doings of that night, and of many other nights in a spectacular career, but I think they're suggestible the same. they show once more how easily illicit adventures, so rarely the subject of authorized history, can be lost. But they also suggest there was a poorly recorded culture in which young men, and I'm afraid despite Philippa's versatility with a pea shooter, it really was just young men, prepared themselves for a life of action. I have talked before to the Society about the literary education which furnished Lymond's mind and shaped his character and opinions. Now I want to consider the extracurricular formation which produced the physical and mental agility which underwrites everything from an impersonation of the Cardinal of Lorraine to being able to destroy a set of strategically important bridges with some floating mills which you've set on fire while you can't actually see them. The first thing I want to say about it is it's not just Lymond. It really was a broader cultural phenomenon. I find this kind of thrilling, actually. They were all like that. When we first meet Gerard Blythe at his prayers in Malta, we are told that he looks prayerful and distant and, unlike the intelligent, talented, and spectacularly wild young gentleman he had been around the time of Solway Moss. Now, I would say that spectacularly wild must encompass, at the very least, a few nights of scaling his college walls, though I very much wish we knew more on that head. Will Scott, similarly, has come back from university with a set of inconvenient morals, but these are all focused on a particular theme, which is the proper conduct of warfare. The much put upon Janet Scott tells Sibylla that he is quoting the laws of chivalry and the Chevalier de Bayard on the ethics of warfare. The Chevalier was a French commander who had died in 1524, so quite recently, who was much celebrated for the nobility of his character, as well as a quite extraordinary record of military success. Though the fact that Will is not averse to lending his own abilities to a band of outlaws, and that he acclimatizes himself to their company so easily, does suggest a reasonable helping of wildness in his character too. And the truth is that these were wild times. I was walking home through Cambridge late last night, the last night of term, the exams over, the sobering results not published until noon today, COVID regulations relaxed, the rain over, several thousand 20-year-olds who have spent the last 18 months at home in their parents' houses, suddenly out in the streets together with what felt like the single aim of shouting at the moon as loud as they could and as long as they could. And I thought, is this ungovernable world, is this what the early modern period felt like? There are some things it definitely had in common with last night. And one thing is extreme youth. The median age in the mid-16th century was 22, which is to say there were as many people under 22 as over 22. Now it's more like 40. So things looked different, they felt different, the faces in the street were younger. It makes a difference in terms of statistics about health and causes of death and house ownership and occupation. But it also matters in respect of much less tangible things like behavior. Hot-headed young men made a much greater impact on early modern society simply because there were so many of them. However, and this is what makes me think that even all the undergraduates of Cambridge baying at the moon is not an adequate comparison. The wild young men of the early modern period were also considerably handier with a sword and buckler and very willing to use them. So the murder rate between 1500 and 1640 was 10 times what it is now. And the most obvious reasons for that are surely that across society, weapons were ubiquitous. You had a sword at your hip, a dagger in your belt, a halberd hanging on the wall just to be handy, and you were taught how to use them. Boys were encouraged to be peaceful in treatises on education, but the same treatises said that when called upon, you had to be prepared to defend your honor in what was called a manly fashion. And this phrase is repeated so often that it becomes clear that manly fashion means with a weapon. And slights to your honor were to be found everywhere. They were as sensitive to offense as Achilles sulking in his tent under the walls of Troy, or Lancelot hesitating to demean himself by traveling in a common cart, even for the sake of saving his true love. And these, of course, were the texts, the Homeric texts, the Mallory. These were the things that they studied and were taught to emulate. It's not just a convenient plot device in Romeo and Juliet that a very bloody fight starts just because one serving man thinks another serving man has bitten his thumb in his direction. We have records of well-documented fights and deaths in the real world over such trivial things too. The artist Caravaggio killed one of his friends over a game of tennis. Christopher Marlowe, the playwright, might have been murdered because of his involvement in espionage. But the cover story that he got into a fight with 3 friends over the bill in a tavern seems perfectly plausible in the period. And the changing structure of society meant that the young men most likely to cause trouble, which is to say, the sons of the gentry and the nobility, who were the only ones in theory allowed to carry a sword, they were no longer, as they had been in the past, training in arms in the house of some great lord to whom they were answerable. Instead, they were being taught their swordplay by a master of defense in town. This was a newly instituted sort of schools of defense, where there wasn't anything like a proper police force to keep the peace. When Archie tells Lymond that there are 500 archers and footmen being sent to look after things in the Rue de Saint-Jacques, Lymond says 500 won't be enough. And Paris is a huge city in this period. It's got 350,000 people living in it. And if all of Paris really is up in arms, as John Knox suggests, 500 is not enough. But in fact, the full city muster was 20 archers, 220 sergeants, and 240 night watchmen, who really only carried sticks around with them. 500 was Archie rounding up for the sake of argument. So the result of all of this was that a few generations, and really just a few generations, because stories tail off in the 17th century and things become more regulated. But nonetheless, a few generations of what their contemporaries called swashbucklers, bragados, roaring boys and roisterers, bruisers and misdoers walking by night. It was hard to control them for the reason that precisely those qualities that made them dangerous, skill in arms, a willingness to fight, the desire to uphold one's honor in combat, were also values enshrined in education and encouraged by the state. It was a paradox that allowed a lot of scope for an inventive young man. I thought it might be useful to set Lymond in the broader context of these generations, so I'm going to offer some comparisons. So, for example, in 1578, Edward Wincham was attacked in Fleet Street in London in broad daylight by 25 retainers in the livery of the second Lord Rich, who was standing by shouting encouragement at his men. Wincham was a resourceful young man. He struggled free and fired a pistol at Lord Rich, which distracted the retainers. And then he escaped into the nearest house, which turned out to be the French embassy. And the French ambassador apparently didn't turn a hair, presumably because this kind of thing just happened all the time. Edward Herbert of Charbury is probably best known as the brother of the saintly poet George Herbert. You know, someone we associate, well, he's literally a saint, I think, in the Anglican Church, famous for his godly poetry. But Edward Herbert recorded a similar attack in London when he was hauled off his horse by Sir John Ayres, who was supported by 4 ruffians. They all came at him with sword and dagger when he was riding past Scotland Yard. Not then a site teeming with law enforcement. It wouldn't be the best choice of locations today. With quite remarkable ferocity, though to be fair, we only have Edward Herbert's word for what happened. He fought them off, but many of the moves he used, cracking heads on the road, for instance, were perhaps not strictly permissible in terms of a gentleman's code of honor. He might have decided, as Renaissance men tend to do, in a way that's different from 18th century men and 19th century men, he might have decided that honor was a dispensable luxury in the circumstances. And next up, we've got Philip Sidney. This is actually a terrible copy, an early copy of the painting in the National Gallery, which is much nicer and more Renaissance looking, but here he is, a little bit pointier than usual, but nonetheless, Philip Sidney. We meet Philip Sidney as a baby in the ringed castle, when his parents are resigned to the fact that they can't get out of calling him after the king, so he's called Philip. Sidney grew up to value skill at arms. A letter survives to his younger brother, Robert, in which he tells him that he should be practicing 2 hours a day with his dagger and his sword. Sidney clearly worked hard enough himself to be confident about his own abilities, because he's quite fierce. There's another extant letter from him to his father's secretary, and he believes his secretary has been reading his private family messages. He says that if he finds this has happened again, I will thrust my dagger into you, and trust to it, for I speak in earnest. One is more likely to credit this threat when one notes that Sidney's nephew famously stabbed his schoolmaster over a dispute in the classroom. There was also the incident of the tennis court quarrel. One day in August 1579, the Earl of Oxford arrived where Sidney was playing tennis with his friends, and the Earl insisted that Sidney yield the court to his social superior. Sidney refused. Oxford, in front of witnesses, called him a puppy. Sidney asked him to repeat his comment, and Oxford did. He couldn't really have backed down at that point, I think. And the result was a challenge to a duel. They were both, at this point, prepared to die over the right to play tennis. The duel wasn't fought because Elizabeth I intervened. Oxford was a favourite of hers, and instead Sidney was exiled from the court. Now, that was just as well for us, really, because while he was away from court, he wrote Astrophil and Stella, which is one of the greatest poetic works in English. And one assumes that if he'd been at court, he mightn't have had so much time for poetry because he would have been challenging people to duels on a regular basis. But it is notable that several of the sonnets in the sequence do make a point of saying how brilliant Sidney is at fighting. There's a lot of self-advertising going on in it. You'll see, by the way, that tennis courts were actually very dangerous places between Sidney and Caravaggio. And it does make me wonder if Liam Rowe should have been a bit more cautious about his visit to the one at the beginning of Queen's Play. If anyone was going to set anybody up for a fight, it was going to happen there in the tennis court. Anyway, with all of this, what I think is really interesting is that nobody thinks that Philip Sidney is a firebrand. In fact, observers tend to describe his gentleness and maturity. His friend Fulk Greville spoke of him as having such staidness of mind, lovely and familiar gravity, as carried grace and reverence above greater years. His talk ever of knowledge, and his very play tending to enrich his mind. So as even his teachers found something in him to observe and learn above that which they had usually read or taught. It does suggest a very different set of standards at work. But then Sidney was destined to be a soldier, and he died of wounds sustained at Zutphen at the age of 31, celebrated for his heroism and his mildness of nature. So war was a duty for the 16th century courtier. Contemporary theory about how to behave, like Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, might have emphasized the gentler arts of poetry and painting. But he also stresses the need to be ready for battle. And indeed, of the men depicted as taking part in the conversations over 4 nights which form the text of the Book of the Courtier, 2 of them, Cesare Gonzaga and Ottaviano Fregoso, would shortly be killed in battle, and Castiglione himself would leave Urbino, where they were all meeting, to go and fight in the papal army. However, while courtiers continued to go to war for all that century and for centuries after that, their role was beginning to change. The world was in a great process of transformation in the Renaissance, and the middle of the 16th century was perhaps the very point when the medieval tipped over into modernity. The religious changes, the changes in art and music, the discovery of new lands, I think they're all developments which are still familiar, but perhaps the greater revolution was in the distribution of power. Across Europe, royal courts were centralizing control and moving it away from the great lords, the great local lords, that is to say, and power in warfare was also changing. For centuries, the nobility had been the leaders of battle. And if we looked at it in the broadest terms, they had been the winners too. Now, new technologies were democratizing that field. This is an issue we see played out in the Lymond Chronicles. Early in the Game of Kings, we hear Dandy Hunter talking to Agnes Herries about her tenants. It's a conversation about how she doesn't want to get married, which we all know isn't true. But what's interesting is the nitty-gritty of the argument that Dandy produces to persuade her that she needs a husband. How much land have you got, Lady Herries? And how many able-bodied tenants, he says. She isn't keen to tell him. but he estimates that it must run to a few thousand. And who do you imagine is going to look after all of that for you and protect it from the English, he says. And if you'll forgive me for being practical, who's going to lead them into the field in wartime? You can't dodge your national obligations. What he's talking about is the relic of a feudal system. The great nobles hold their lands from the crown, and in return, they are obliged to muster men to follow their sovereign into battle. As a result of this, a nobleman's house in the 15th century would have been marked out by a large crowd of retainers, not just tenants, but second sons of lesser nobles. Serving as gentlemen retainers, they had light duties, pleasant conditions, but they were also trained in arms because they had to be prepared to ride to battle with their lord, and that's how the deal worked for them. They would ride to battle wearing his livery. Now, this system was dying out because the lords were becoming too powerful. Their retainers essentially formed private armies, and they could use them to pursue private feuds or even to plot rebellion. The Tudors were particularly worried about this, and they tried to legislate against it. So one thing they did was that in 1504, they confined the wearing of a lord's livery only to his household servants to get rid of this impression of a military uniform. And under Queen Mary, serious efforts were made to appoint lord lieutenants to supervise the muster and to plan for a conscript army. And of course, a conscript army centralized under a centrally appointed set of lord lieutenants is very different from the loyalties that would be involved if you were fighting on behalf of the Duke of Norfolk or some other major magnate who was local to you and part of your system of loyalty. Now, in Scotland, it's a little bit different. We still see retainers riding into battle and wearing livery. Will's secret meeting with his father is broken up by advancing troops in blue and silver, by which his father recognizes that the Coulters are coming. However, the Scottish crown, at least, knows that this is not the future. Mary of Guise wants St. Mary's, a professional army. And at least for a time, this is what Russia wants and what France wants. Their interest is not just in questions of loyalty and anxiety about private feuds, though it is clear that tensions between, let's say, the Scots and the Cars pose an obstacle to bigger issues of national security. But it's also the case that warfare was changing. The great houses might have prepared a boy to fight on foot and on horse with sword and axe and halberd and dagger and even some rudimentary handguns, but only professional armies had heavy artillery, and mines and sappers, and those were now the means by which battles were won. So Lymond is the second son. He doesn't have the burden of tenants that Richard or Agnes Herries have to consider. Instead, he is the epitome of the new man of the Renaissance, operating largely outside feudal loyalties, working for centralized powers and the idea of nation, relying on knowledge, science, and charisma for his success. It is the case, though, that training in arms was not only for war. As the translator of The True Art of Defense by the Italian fencing master Giacomo di Grassi put it in 1594, because this art is a principal member of the military profession, which altogether, with learning, is the ornament of the world, therefore it ought not to be exercised in brawls and frays as men commonly practice it. He's thinking of those boys picking fights on the street. But as honourable knights ought to reserve themselves and exercise it for the advantage of their country, the honour of women, and the conquering of hosts and armies. De Grassi anticipated service of one's country, but he also expected questions of honour to be contested in arms. And this brings us back both to the duel over tennis courts and thumb biting, but also to their official cousin, the trial by combat. Trial by combat was a leftover of a medieval system of justice. However, in its assertion that force could prove a moral point, it operated on exactly the same principles as the duel. It was falling into abeyance by the 16th century, although a famous trial by combat did take place in Dublin Castle in 1583, presided over by the Viceroy as representative of the Crown. And Lymond, of course, takes part in another trial by combat in Flaw Valleys in 1548. This is, as de Grassi anticipated, a fight about a woman's honour. because Lymond refuses to take up his sword against his brother on any of the challenges offered, from conspiracy against the state to attempted murder, until Richard suggests that Lymond has ruined Christian Stuart, now lying dead upstairs. This fight is something for which all the men present have been training all their lives. They all understand the rules. Tom Erskine presides and establishes the regulations. It will be distinguished legally from murder, he said, because it will be fought under his supervision, as though in Scotland in sham clo, he says, that is to say in the lists, in the area set apart for formal combat. It will have the status of a legal trial in the place of the courtroom awaiting Lymond in Edinburgh. The spectators all know their business and retreat to the ends of the hall behind ropes that are strung up to keep them back. And Gideon Somerville, fulfilling all the duties of a gentlemanly host, produces a bound volume of the Gospels so the combatants can take the official oath, promising not to use witchcraft to cheat. And also he produces a pair of matched rapiers and 2 daggers. Now, in this moment, Gideon also helpfully provides an answer to a question which has dogged historians for centuries. Technologies of combat are subject to change, and this is something to which Lymond has been shown to be alert. When Will Scott offers his services to Lymond and his merry men earlier in the Game of Kings, he is thoroughly catechized about his various abilities. Can he swim? Can he hunt? Can he wrestle? Can he use the crossbow? Can he count and read and write? And it's clear that Lymond, who knows exactly who Will is teasing him. The Scot heir, newly returned from the Grand Collège in Paris, is certainly literate, though it's actually interesting that a generation before that wouldn't have been something to take for granted. The other questions are to do with aptness for fighting. Hunting, for instance, was considered good practice because it taught a man how to read the terrain, which was an important aspect of battle. Wrestling and crossbow sound innocuous enough until the next question, broadsword or rapier. Lymond is teasing this young man about being a country bumpkin. Crossbows were out of date. Like wrestling and the use of a broadsword, they were the skills belonging to a generation who had been taught by a war veteran, an astore, let's say, retained in a great house to pass on a medley of techniques, but they were not the scientific approach to battle in a new age. In battle, the firearm, the hackbutt, would take over from the crossbow with its awkward, heavy loading mechanism. And in single combat, the broadsword would be replaced by the rapier. Now, one might explain the popularity of the rapier in the 16th century by pointing to fashion. I've got a picture for you here. Let's see. Yes, okay. The broadsword was a slashing implement, sharp along the edge, but not at the tip. It was very heavy and needed the weight behind a swinging movement. So you can see in this 15th century text, which looks very medieval, diagrams from texts on fencing show that you held your broadsword above your head and swung it down. But a fashionable doublet in the 16th century did not allow a gentleman to lift his arm above his shoulder. You might strip to your shirt for duel, but if attacked on the street, which incidentally happened all the time, you wouldn't be able to wriggle out of your clothes at speed. 16th century clothes were very time consuming. Instead, you needed a lightweight weapon you could thrust from the elbow or shoulder height, and the needle-sharp rapier made that possible. And here you can see 2 men fighting with rapiers and able to keep their arms pretty much at shoulder level. The rapier was a very dangerous weapon, and many accidental deaths happening at great speed were reported throughout the period. Significantly for Lymond, not the largest of men, the rapier also removed much of the advantage of height and weight, which had previously been so important. Skill and speed suddenly mattered much more than reach. And people were anxious to acquire those skills. A series of Italian fencing masters brought their continental skills to London and set up prestigious fencing academies and published their theories. If anyone here, besides reading Dunnett, has seen the fight scene in The Princess Bride, you may be happy to know that the authorities, whose names are bandied back and forth by the man in black and Inigo Montoya as they fight on the Cliffs of Despair, something like that, are all real. And and that given we still have their books, there is a lively ongoing debate online about whether Bonetti does indeed cancel out Capo Ferro. But that same conversation was also being held in the 16th century. But there is one curious thing about Gideon's preparedness. Gideon's collection of swords is interesting. The rapier was already being used in Italy and in France in the 1550s, but there is some delay in its arrival on this island. By the 1590s, fighting with rapiers was so fashionable that even the playhouse started to respond. The stage at the Curtain Theatre was exactly the same in dimensions as a modern fencing piece. And the plays written to be performed there, like Romeo and Juliet in about 1595, those are the ones with the particularly high octane fencing matches. Shakespeare owned a part share in a fencing school. It was clearly something that, someone with a bit of money would get into. But there remains a dispute about when it all began. I've seen 1576 and 1586 given by various scholars as the dates by which rapiers were available in England, with a consensus around 1580. The one outlier, Lawrence Stone, has suggested that there is a record of a rapier in Henry VIII's armoury in 1540. Critics have responded that even if the king owned one, it wasn't used as we envisage it, particularly given that a law made by Henry VIII in 1538 specifically outlawed thrusting with a sword, and rapiers really are only for thrusting. However, the evidence of the trial by combat in Flaw Valleys suggests that Stone must have been right. There must have been an early and undocumented but thriving culture of dueling with the rapier in England, perhaps focused around the royal court where Gideon has been, because Gideon has the weapons on hand when they are needed. I think we can also extrapolate from this duel that the science of the rapier was familiar, though also badly documented, in Scotland. We can probably assume that the Crawfords learned this continental style of fighting from a very up-to-date master in France. But the fact that Tom Erskine raises no objection to the use of these weapons in a legal context suggests that they were familiar and acceptable. Scotland can thus be shown, yet again, to be a generation at least ahead of English law, as the trial by combat in Dublin in 1583 was fought using the by then old-fashioned but legally enshrined broadsword and target, whereas Flaw Valleys was already ahead of the game in 1548. Lymond, in fact, is not much of a duelist. He was certainly not given to the hair-trigger provocations of his age, though one suspects that Will and Gerrit in their younger days might have been more vulnerable to being jostled in the street or being called a puppy or disagreeing over a point in tennis, all the things that really mattered in life. We see Lymond in single combat quite frequently, but rarely in the formal framework of challenge and duel. Attempts to drown your enemy in the sea or to stab him in a darkened winter garden do not perhaps lend themselves readily to the courtesies of the code of honour. The closest he comes is the great set piece of the fight with Gabriel before the altar of St. Giles, a fight conducted, as you may remember, not with the two-handed sword of the Knights of St. John, which would incidentally have told to Gabriel's advantage given his height and strength. Instead, since Gabriel stabs the deacon with his sword tip, I think we must again assume a rapier in one hand, and we know they each had a dagger in the other. Again, whether learned in Malta or at St. Mary's, this is a technique well ahead of its trend. But then, as we are told more than once, these really are the greatest warriors in Europe. Nonetheless, the formality of the encounter removes it from the typical duel, with its very personal grudge. Instead, when Lymond has Gabriel temporarily at his mercy, he turns to the language of the law. For Will Scott, for Wat Scott his father, for Thomas Wishart and Trotty Lackup, for the pain you occasioned the Somervilles and the corruption and death of your sister, for what above all you hope to do to this realm of Scotland, I call your life forfeit. He says nothing about the injuries and slights done to him. In this battle, he is an instrument of the crown, not a private citizen. The rapier, even its proponents admitted, was not a very good weapon of war, but it was ideal for a duel or a tussle on a street. But the earlier generations of masters of defense had taught their students something useful too. Their advice included something much rougher and readier. kicking and wrestling, and a general resourcefulness, which we also see at work in Lymond's style. He was at the crossing place between these two ways of fighting. And I think the combination must have fed into the versatility which characterizes his approach. The pragmatism, the unwillingness to get drawn into arguments about the bubble honor, and the idealistic nationalism are all features we can find elsewhere in the period, among scholars and philosophers. But I think the lethal combination is all his own. I'm going to finish now with one final insight from the world of swordplay. It's a curious thing that there is so very little dancing in the accounts of Lymond's life. I don't know if anyone else has been disturbed about this. Dancing is absolutely central to court culture in the Renaissance, and the fact that we don't really see Lymond engaging in it prompts the anxious thought that perhaps he might have been too busy becoming proficient in every other art known to man to have perfected his performance in this one. After all, you can be an excellent musician and not be light on your feet. However, the sword fighting manuals from this period look very like lessons in dancing. The overlap was so great that the fencing masters frequently doubled as teachers of dance. To be, as we are assured he is, one of the greatest swordsmen in Christendom would suggest that Lymond is very light on his feet. And although you can be a superb swordsman and not musical, this clearly does not apply in his case. It is my happy conclusion then to report to all of you that although we are not assured of it in the official record, nonetheless, Lymond must have danced divinely. And we are safe in assuming the perfect execution of a pavan or galliard when the occasion called for it, just as we know he can climb a belfry or impersonate a cardinal any evening of the week.
Thank you, Deirdre.